Welcome to Perspectives in Mobile, the news podcast from the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. Join us discussing the world of telecommunications, technology, and mobile innovations. From Florence, Riccardo Amati.
Welcome to a new episode of MEF Podcast Series Perspectives, in which experts and industry leaders talk about what they think, see, and expect in the world of technology, telecommunications, and innovative mobile services. The scandal involving US top officials using the Signal messaging app for highly sensitive discussions has raised questions about the app's security and potential vulnerabilities. While Signal is praised for its end-to-end encryption, the incident underscores the challenges of ensuring the safety of communications. This may prompt further scrutiny and advancements in messaging technologies, potentially reshaping standards in the mobile ecosystem. We are joined by Ben Wood, Chief Analyst and Chief Marketing Officer at CCS Insight. Ben, thank you for being here today.
Absolute pleasure. Great to be with you.
With over 25 years of experience in the mobile sector, Ben is recognized as one of the top tech analysts in the US and Europe. He also leads CCS Insight's annual predictions event and is the founder of the Mobile Phone Museum, a non-profit dedicated to preserving the history of mobile technology. Ben, we all remember the iconic images of US officials gathered in the White House, a specific office, a small office, watching the raid that led to the killing of Osama bin Laden. Now it's a completely different situation. They chat about attacking the Houthi rebels in Yemen on Signal. And what does shift mean for secure communication? I mean, the shift from in-person, observation to encrypted apps like Signal. What does it tell us from the mobile ecosystem angle? Better not to trust apps too much? Should we wait for future evolutions? What's your take?
Well, I think, obviously the White House will continue to use its control room, which is super secure, no electronic devices. What we've seen with this update of officials using Signal, I think represents the fact that we are seeing politicians all over the world embracing public messaging systems to communicate with each other. We've seen in other countries around the world the prolific use of WhatsApp to communicate, but this was a very, very rare example of highly sensitive national security potentially related content being shared over a public network. Now, the officials have denied there was anything sensitive that was shared, but I think it reflects the kind of overall way in which people want to have immediate communications. And if there was one platform to choose, Signal was probably the best one. But needless to say, I think lessons have been learned, and I can't imagine we'll see this happening again.
So anyway, we can be confident in Signal. It is a secure app.
Well, I think that of all of the different apps out there, Signal pride themselves on having extremely strong end-to-end encryption. Lots of fail-safes. They don't keep hold of personal data. Individual connections are established between individual people within those groups that are established. So there are lots of reasons why it's a great way to communicate if you want to have secure communications, and it's why it does appeal to businesses and people who just want to make sure they've got the maximum security. But I don't think anyone would say that public messaging services are particularly well suited to highly sensitive government communications and those sorts of things. But in this case, let's not forget that the challenge here was nothing to do with security at all. This was a human failing. Someone was added to that group inadvertently and ended up getting access to all the content. So, we have to be very careful talking here. There was no breach. There was no technical breakdown. There was no interception. Signal did its job. It's just someone made the mistake of adding the wrong person, unfortunately a journalist, which meant this quickly went into the public domain.
And that's pretty clear. What's the difference between Signal end-to-end system and other ones? You were saying is more secure than not, and you gave examples, but can you elaborate about the specific?
Well, the strength of the encryption that Signal are using is considered to be, very much, a best-in-class approach to encryption. Furthermore, the fact that they don't maintain copies of messages and communications is very, very important indeed. So you can't go back and download your messages in the way that you can with WhatsApp, for example. That's not to say that other platforms are not focused on security. Most of them are using end-to-end encryption, whether it's iMessage, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's other platforms. It's just that Signal have doubled down from a security perspective in order to make sure that they are offering the most secure means of communication possible.
Let's expand the conversation to end-to-end. I mean, in general, to end-to-end encryption in mobile messaging. RCS, Rich Communication Services, has been touted as a potential successor to SMS. However, there have been concerns about its security and encryption capabilities. How does RCS, for example, compare with Signal? If it's a comparison that we can make, you're the expert, and we are just asking questions. But how can you compare that in terms of security and in terms of what consumers can get from these consumers and businesses?
Well, I haven't done a detailed analysis of the way RCS have implemented the security, but there'll be security pieces in there. RCS is more about the evolution of messaging for mobile network operators, for carriers, who want to have a richer means of sharing messages. So rather than just the plain text message, the SMS service, short message service, this provides more of an experience which is like the one that you would receive on something like iMessage or WhatsApp, where you can see things like read receipts. You can see when people are actually typing. You can send richer content. So, for example, images, emojis, and those sorts of things, and acknowledgements to messages. And it's a very, very important platform for operators, probably a decade too late, to be quite frank, because if you look at the evolution of text messaging, which is where my career started back in the mid-1990s, when I was working at Vodafone and was working with the team that launched the original text messaging service, the operators at that point really had the stranglehold on text. And we saw this transition where people moved from very much a voice interaction with devices to more of a visual interaction with devices. And that has been relentless ever since. But the operators really became very complacent. They were charging huge amounts of money for text messaging. And then really the product that kind of disrupted them the most was BlackBerry's BBM service, which was the ability to send point-to-point messages free of charge, or at least baked into your subscription. Subsequent to that, BlackBerry decided they didn't want to open it up to be a cross-platform solution. And that's when WhatsApp and other things like Facebook Messenger were able to jump in and take the opportunity. But RCS is the operator's response, a standard that had been developed over years and years and years, but has now been very actively embraced by Google. And most importantly, in the US market, it means that there's a much richer bridge between people with an Android phone and people with an Apple iPhone. So you can start to get richer messages between those two platforms, particularly for things like photographs.
Right. The fact that RCS is in different platforms, is that a pro or a con? I mean, not just in terms of security, but in terms of exploiting it. I'm thinking about a business point of view as well, in terms of advertising and this kind of very important aspect of the app.
Absolutely. I mean, advertising using messaging is very popular. And the richer the messages, the better. We've not seen huge amounts of investment in that area so far, but with more predictability and wider reach of richer messaging platforms like RCS, we can see that growing. WhatsApp have been extremely adept at building advertising platforms, having solutions for business owners. We're seeing major brands now engaging on WhatsApp in the kind of community channels that they have. So messaging certainly plays a very, very important role in the advertising space. And I think the challenge is making sure that that is managed in a way that it doesn't become intrusive for users, and there is a lot of attention paid particularly towards spam and fraudulent messages, where users need to be extremely careful of things like phishing attacks, and obviously don't want to be bombarded with an endless stream of messages that they haven't requested.
Right, so we'll see more and more of this carrier-based messaging solution like RCS, and not just RCS in the future. Is it possible to imagine a convergence of all these technologies that incorporate stronger security into RCS or something similar? I mean, it's just spreading in different directions in terms of the ownership of the different technologies, or do you see a convergence?
On all of these platforms, security is going to be a central pillar of what is delivered. None of these platforms want to have security challenges. They're all using encryption of one form or another where they can. Some of that's legislative. You can't always have really strong encryption, but in most cases there will be some high degree of security built in. But then there are different business models. Signal have taken a specific approach to double down on security. But in some other examples, they might not want to do that. For example, as I said with WhatsApp, you want to be able to download your messages. You want that audit trail, which is important. But make no mistake, there'll be lots of focus on security always. It's the most important thing. Beyond that, in terms of convergence of these different platforms, ultimately there's a business case here as well, and they will deliberately want to differentiate from each other. But the ubiquity of something like Signal or WhatsApp or any of these independent platforms which will work across Android and on PCs and on Apple iPhones and any other places they want to deploy it makes them very, very attractive. But in some cases, there are business models like Apple with iMessage who have decided that they will keep full control of iMessage for numerous different reasons. One is security. Another reason is the fact that it builds on their ecosystem, and you hear an awful lot of discussion of the kind of blue bubble versus the green bubble, and obviously blue bubbles is where you've got the iPhone, and that builds communities. People become, it's another way of effectively locking people into a particular platform because they become dependent on that, and they want to be able to communicate with their friends and families and colleagues through that mechanism.
Is this a question of trust, of course, building trust? I mean, we're talking about security, and it's a big part of trust, of course. But it's not just security. It's not just about security, isn't it?
No, it's trust, it's brand, it's reach. Make no mistake, any messaging platform that has some major security breach is going to struggle. They're going to pay a price for that. So they have to make sure they're secure. But as you say, it's also about brand. It's also about reach. It's also about usability, the design of the application, how it works across a whole span of different devices. With WhatsApp, it's a really ubiquitous service for me. It's a fantastic way to bridge messaging across different ecosystems. All my friends and family and colleagues are all using WhatsApp, and it doesn't matter what device we're using. I can be messaging from my Mac, from my Android phone, even from my smartwatch. Now I have a client directly on the smartwatch which I can use to access WhatsApp, which is really, really a great way of being able to keep connected all of the time.
About these bubbles we were talking about, maybe you can elaborate on that. But first, a question here. What do you make of Facebook going back to the roots, to its roots, and creating, a space for family and friends?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think that, that's a slightly different side topic, but a great topic to discuss insofar as I think what Facebook want to do is drive engagement. They want to make sure that people can get the experience that they want. And obviously, it's a user configurable aspect. But if there's a risk to Facebook that they could start losing customers or losing engagement, then they're going to make adjustments as appropriate. And in the end of the day, don't be under any illusion that not being able to see content from third parties if you want to really focus your timeline on friends doesn't mean that Facebook isn't still gathering information on you in terms of your preferences and topics and demographics and those sorts of things. So for Facebook, it felt like an interesting opportunity to add a bit of interest to the platform, address the concerns that some people have raised in terms of feeling like they were overwhelmed with a vast variety of different things in their feed. And some users will like that, but it's all about choice. So I think they should be applauded for listening to their users and coming back with some feedback, which is quite interesting.
Can you elaborate on the bubbles you were talking about? Would you think of that in terms of creating an identity like incorporation or?
Well, I think that for those who don't know, if you're using an iPhone, this is very specific to the iPhone. iPhone's messaging service communicates directly from one iPhone to another. You can only use the full rich messaging service if you're communicating between iPhones, and those messages come through with a blue bubble in the kind of user interface for the messaging experience. If you were messaging between an iPhone and an Android phone, you'd get a less rich experience, and the messages from the non-iPhone would come through with a green bubble. And this started this kind of discussion around which bubbles have you got. And ultimately, RCS, to some extent, has addressed this a little bit, but they're not totally converged. It just means you're getting a richer messaging service between an Android phone and an iPhone. But the blue bubble, green bubble thing can be positioned as a bit of a kind of, you've got an iPhone and I haven't, or I've got an iPhone and you haven't, and you're not part of the club. But then there's also, occasionally challenges that if people are using group messaging on an iPhone and someone hasn't got iMessage enabled, there could be messages that don't necessarily immediately get through because they get lost somewhere. And it's just an interesting way of Apple differentiating their solution versus others. And I have heard stories of people who've been in cycling clubs or running clubs or school distribution lists or whatever, where ultimately over a period of time, it's become apparent that they might get a richer and better service if they had an iPhone themselves. And it's been one of the factors which has encouraged them to switch their loyalties from an Android phone to an iOS-powered iPhone. That's just one factor in that whole story. But it is interesting that Apple has vigorously kind of resisted opening up iMessage to other platforms in order to maintain it as a unique characteristic of the iPhone.
Going back to where we began, really, as governments and corporations demand more secure communication, what role public policy should have and will have in regulating encryption, protecting privacy in the messaging apps we're talking about?
Well, it's a constant topic of discussion. Primarily because of the fact that governments worry about the fact that if people are able to use the kind of encryption that is available on these platforms, and most of the platforms we've talked about will have some level of this encryption, some stronger than others. It does mean that if you want to have access to messaging history or people's messaging for law enforcement, anti-terrorism, scenarios, other things, fraud, whatever, it's very, very difficult. So governments constantly look at this, but it's a balance between people's ability to have their freedom to communicate versus what government intervention there is. I think it's a very challenging topic for governments to regulate around, and it's certainly extremely difficult to have prescriptive legislation that can cover all of the bases. But more than that, the technology platforms and the tech players who offer these services have made it very clear that they don't necessarily want to go down that route. So Apple, for example, I think would rather exit a market or turn a service off rather than being obliged to offer a backdoor into a service for a government. And so that's the kind of status quo that we've reached now, which is the tech companies are holding firm and saying, no, we believe we need to look after the interests of our users.
And that was exactly my next question about backdoors. I mean, our government foes of these technologies, we are seeing governments proposing the idea of backdoor into encrypted communication for security reasons. You just said what Apple would probably think about it. I mean, what it thinks and what Apple would do if that idea was were implemented. How such backdoors affect the integrity of platform like the ones we are talking about? Is there a way to balance privacy and national security? I mean, it's just something that goes different ways, or is there a possibility of balancing the two?
I think the problem with the so-called backdoor is the fact that, in principle, you could make arguments to suggest it's a good idea to have this for something like, concerns about terrorism or national security. But the problem is, once you add a backdoor to a platform, that adds a security vulnerability. So, in the perfect world, it wouldn't be an issue. But unfortunately, there are many bad actors who would look to seek to exploit that vulnerability and maybe use it in inappropriate ways. And history shows that when there are backdoors into technology platforms, they will get exploited for nefarious purposes. So I don't think that's something that any of these platforms are going to countenance, unless there is a specific requirement in a certain market where they may choose to do something different. But that's a commercial decision. But basically, most of the tech players have said this is not something that they're prepared to entertain.
Anyway, end-to-end encryption, it means that you don't see who's the other side. And that, of course, opens up to possible criminal activities.
Well, in the end of the day, criminality is something that's existed since the beginning of time. And, people will exploit different platforms. But, all of these platforms are running these platforms in good faith. If they find evidence of that, they're going to work with the authorities probably to disclose it, but ultimately they're not going to provide access to their platforms. And this is the age-old challenge of any kind of technology, which will be that the vast majority of people use it as a force for good, but there may well be some bad actors that decide to exploit it. But equally, without very, very secure platforms, good security on those platforms, the risk to people using them in terms of having their data intercepted, having important personal information stolen and more is probably much, much higher.
Yeah, I mean, criminals are not specific to the mobile ecosystem. This is probably something that,
exactly,
with all our concerns about security, we should always keep in mind. And anyway, just in general, to wrap up what we were saying in the last 20 minutes at this point, what role do you think new technologies like AI and blockchain might have for security, but just in general to enhance the offer that those the apps we are talking about are giving to businesses and consumers?
Well, the big, funnily enough, rather than enhancements, it's more what are the challenges to security in the future? And quantum computing is the big, big hot topic, which is if we successfully get to an era of quantum computing, you will have compute power that is so immense that it will actually make it possible to crack some of the encryption keys that are being used today. And this is the endless kind of game of cat and mouse with technology as people, constantly improve and technology becomes more powerful. And therefore it's little surprise that all major technology companies already have initiatives around quantum compute and making sure that their platforms would be able to resist interruptions through people using quantum computing to try and crack keys. So I think that this is a never-ending story with regards to the investments that need to be made to keep our communications secure. And ultimately, probably this whole incident has been a great opportunity for this to come into the public domain and for people to think very carefully about how they communicate, what they communicate, and what platforms that they use.
At the end of the day, is up to the humans. To
and let's not forget that the vast majority of security breaches are nothing
different type of humans.
Exactly.
Or fortunately enough, that's probably.
Yeah, and let's not forget the vast majority of security breaches are human-related breaches, whether it's a phishing attack, whether it's just a human error, as was the case in the US government list, where ultimately someone was added to a list. It was nothing to do with the security. So the human being is often the single point of failure.
Or a stupid official adding a newspaper man to the signal chat, which is really incredible. Ben, thank you so much for shedding light on these important issues. It's clear that the future of mobile messaging is going to be shaped by, both technological advancement and ongoing conversation between humans about privacy, security, regulation. We appreciate your insights today. Ben Wood, Chief Analyst and CMO at CCS Insight. And that's all for this episode of Perspective, the MEF podcast where experts and industry leaders talk about what they think, see, and expect in the world of technology, telecommunications, and innovative mobile services. Stay tuned. From Riccardo Amati, goodbye and good luck with your work.
Thanks for listening to Perspectives in Mobile. Join us next as we explore telecoms, technology, and mobile innovations. Stay tuned, stay connected, and let's unlock the mobile potential together.